Yeah. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Alan Levine, the director of the Political Theory Institute. Together with my colleague, Tom Merrill, we run this. I just want to mention three upcoming talks on October 16th. Liberalism Without Illusion by Bill Galston of the Brookings Institute. On November 6th, Homer's Odyssey and Its Migrations, Displacement, Wandering, and Identity. It's our Lincoln Scholars Lecture by Daniel Mendelsohn of Bard College. And on November 17th, The Politics of the Enlightenment, G.E. Lessing and the Question of Tolerance, with Hannes Kerber of Boston College. Today, we're here to talk about a book that, when I read it, sickened me. Not your arguments, the lies, the half-truths, the conflicts of interest that it reveals. We see perhaps otherwise good people dishonestly dealing with the public on hard scientific issues, often with a very moralistic, clear conscience. Maybe the public can't handle the truth, but in a liberal democracy, we must try, at least to some extent, and certainly more than was done during COVID. Our speaker today is one of the nation's leading public intellectuals and a fierce advocate for clarifying the difficulties of dealing with complex issues in the liberal democracy. Stephen Macedo is the Lawrence Rockefeller Professor of Politics in the University Center for Human Values at Princeton University. He's the author of 4 books, most recently this one that I just referred to, In COVID's Wake. He's also co-authored, edited, or co-edited more than 20 other books. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Academy of Science and Letters, because of course there must be 2. He's the immediate past president of the American Society for Political and Legal Philosophy, former vice president of the American Political Science Association, and he earned 5 degrees. His BA is from William and Mary. He's got master's degrees from both Oxford and the London School of Economics, as well as an MA and PhD from Princeton. He's making a late career of tackling difficult moral and political issues with empirically informed data to counter the polarizing half-truths so prominent in our politics today. He was with us 5 years ago, and he talked about these issues with immigration, armed with data, and he was PTI's first speaker 30 years ago. I'm proud to say he's also my friend. So please join me in welcoming Steve Macedo on In COVID's Wake, Science, Liberal Democracy, and Elite Failure.
Thank you all very much. We are old friends, and this is working, I guess, the mic. However, I've been called a lot of nasty names in my life, but I've never before been called a public intellectual. Forgive you for that. Anyway, so be it. That's the book. I hope I'm not in the way of the slides for some people, but there we go. So I'm going to give an overview of kind of some of the central arguments of the book, and show a lot of slides. So some of them are going to go by rather fast, but that's okay. We can back up later. At a basic level, the book is about what the pandemic revealed about and contributed to the degraded state of liberal democracy in America. And we have many colleagues who focus on the dangers of right-wing authoritarianism and right-wing populism, quite properly. But we think that educated elites also need to pay attention to their own shortcomings and their own failures if we want to keep the institutions we care so much about, liberal science, journalism, universities, in good form. So that's what we try to do in the book, is look critically at some of the shortcomings of educated institutions under COVID, And we were calling them the truth-seeking departments of liberal democracy, science, journalism, universities. And we think they did not perform as well as they should have under the influence of polarization and politicization and the moralization, the premature moralization of disagreement and intolerance of dissent. And we think these were educated elites failing to live up to their own fundamental values of liberal inquiry and openness to criticism. So, So remembering back at the pandemic, it was a bad virus. It was a bad pandemic. It was the worst pandemic in a century. In March and April 2020, images of hospital wards being overwhelmed in northern Italy. A tsunami is how the newspapers reported. Very, very frightening. Oops. Uh-oh. Okay. Right. In New York City, refrigerated trucks, because the hospitals were being overwhelmed with body bags. It was very frightening images, and there was a lot of fear and panic, without question. And, by early April 2020, astonishingly, there were 3.9 billion people globally living under some form of lockdown. Half the world's population. We've never remotely experienced attempts to suppress a respiratory virus in this kind of way. By far, the most radical response to a pandemic in human history. Now, it was the worst pandemic in a century, since 1918 to 1919, the biggest global crisis since World War II. And of course, we're armchair quarterbacks. We're looking back in hindsight. Hindsight is 2020, or maybe something a little closer anyway. But nevertheless, we need a comprehensive reassessment, a broadly political reassessment, and that's what we try to provide in the book, a kind of overview of what happened and how we should reflect on it going forward. So one important background fact here, I think, that's relevant to what happened is the stronger association of educated elites with the Democratic Party than was the case in the past. As we were talking about just a little while ago with the student group, the partisan divide is an education divide now to a great extent. And whereas about 23% of Democrats had a four-year college degree in 1999, that's up to 48% by 2021. And likewise, people with graduate degrees and so on are overwhelmingly on the political left. Republicans have remained steady. So there's a danger of greater danger of partisanship, I think, as a consequence of the greater partisan inflection of elite educational institutions. And again, I think that may be one influence in the background here. So this talk is going to have 5 parts. First, what did we know about pandemic planning before COVID? Because the fact is there were a couple of decades of pre-COVID pandemic plans, particularly looking at non-pharmaceutical interventions, all of the measures that were undertaken before the vaccines were available and drugs were available, border closures, contact tracing, quarantine, school closures, social distancing measures, masking. All of these measures were have been subject of a couple of decades of pre-COVID pandemic planning, and there were assessments of them, which I'll talk about. Second, the early descent from the lockdowns in March and April 2020, and the rise of intolerance over the summer as we track it. Thirdly, what did the United States do? How did they diverge, the 50 laboratories of democracy, and how did that work out? We'll see that there was quite a large partisan split. Fourth, misinformation or reasonable policy disagreement. This will move to the larger question of how much reasonable disagreement is being coded as misinformation, and we'll talk about that. That's a real danger going forward. And fifth, why did we do it and what should we learn? So first, what do we know about pandemic planning before COVID? Well, the World Health Organization did one of these overviews of non-pharmaceutical intervention. It came out in November 2019, just a few weeks before the COVID pandemic. It was a revision of previous documents. And among the statements early on in that report are not recommended in any circumstances: contact tracing, quarantine of exposed individuals, entry and exit screening, internal travel restrictions, and border closures. Not recommended under any circumstances, even under the most severe pandemic. Workplace closure should be a last step considered only in extraordinarily severe epidemics and pandemics. And the quality of the evidence supporting this recommendation was rated as very low. Indeed, the quality of the evidence in support of all of the recommendations was rated as very low or poor. School closures could have a major impact on the safety, health, and nutrition of children in lower income families in particular, and so potentially not cost effective. School closures raise major ethical issues for families and communities. That's World Health Organization. Johns Hopkins in 2019, a few months before, over the summer of 2019, had a report. It's important to communicate to political leaders the absence of evidence surrounding many non-pharmaceutical interventions and the adverse consequences that may follow from them. The general sort of main point of these pre-COVID measures, the majority of them was, there's a very weak evidentiary basis for all of these social distancing measures, and they will inevitably be costly. And those costs need to be communicated to the public before they're adopted. It's a responsibility of public officials. The UK did a major study in 2011 and put out plans. These were still in effect at the beginning of COVID. The UK plan says it almost certainly will not be possible to contain or eradicate a new virus in its country of origin or on arrival to the UK. The expectation must be that the virus will inevitably spread, and that any local measures taken to disrupt or reduce the spread are likely to have very limited or partial success at a national level and cannot be relied upon even as a way to buy time. Professor Robert Dingwall was a member of this study group. We've actually been in touch with him. He's still active in a scholarly way. And he said during COVID, close attention was paid to whether we might shut borders, restrict internal travel, and shut schools. But we decided these things were unworkable or at worst counterproductive. And he also said towards the end of the COVID pandemic, we had the right plan in place, but when COVID came, we ignored it. Now, there were enthusiasts for the non-pharmaceutical interventions. There were mathematical modelers in particular who exercised a strong influence during the George W. Bush administration. He read in 2005, there was a general interest in studying these measures in the event of a future pandemic, which was inevitable. There was also a biosecurity component. There was also fears about bioweapons after 9/11 in particular, but more generally. And Bush read John Barry's book on the Great Influenza over the summer, and that was one of the things that persuaded him to put billions of dollars into future pandemic planning. And the mathematical modelers who modeled social interactions with computer projections, rather speculatively, were among the groups that were very optimistic about the effectiveness of these measures. And so, for example, this implementation plan from May 2006, modeling supports school closure as an effective means of reducing overall attack rates within communities. The value of this intervention is maximized if school closure occurs early in the course of a community outbreak. Now, just how early is early enough is not clear. A lot of these viruses mimic the symptoms of flus or cold. So detecting them early is a tough thing. In fact, but they were most enthusiastic about school closures because they thought that school children were like close talkers from Seinfeld. You just can't keep kids apart. So the most important thing was to keep kids out of school and keep them isolated at home. I should say these models do not model the costs of those measures for children. There was also some scholarship looking back at the 1918 pandemic and comparing cities' approach to the 1918 pandemic. And St. Louis imposed a lot more closures than Philadelphia. The early studies suggested that one influential analysis said that cities that imposed NPIs had a 50% reduction in peak death rates. This was quoted a lot later on. The strategy remained controversial, and indeed, these claims about 1918 have since been re-examined, and the association between these measures and reductions in mortality has been, as people now doubt that there was a significant relation. The Institute of Medicine did a report in response to these early Bush measures. A team of scientists and social scientists were assembled. They examined the empirical evidence behind these and were skeptical about the non-pharmaceutical interventions. They emphasized that total mortality in the 1918 pandemic was only weakly associated with the interventions, and that the model does not explain much variation across cities. They declined to endorse the use of non-pharmaceutical interventions in future pandemics because it is almost impossible to say, based on the evidence we have then, and that's true now too, that the interventions, either individually or in combination, will be effective. And it warned that in the midst of a crisis, and this was quite prescient, in the midst of a crisis, leaders would have incentives to deploy these measures, even in the absence of proven benefits and without considerations of secondary effects or costs, to show that they were in charge, to show that they were getting tough, to show that they're exercising leadership by imposing hard measures. For political reasons, that's to say, not for public health or scientific reasons. Dr. D.A. Henderson, who's the scientist, epidemiologist most credited with helping to eradicate smallpox, and spent decades in public health, was the dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, 1977 to 1990. He also wrote very skeptically on these non-pharmaceutical interventions, and it said, this is part of an article that he co-wrote with others in around 2006, yes. Experience shows that there's no basis for recommending quarantine, either of groups or individuals. The problems of implementing such measures are formidable, and secondary effects, such as the loss of public trust in government, are likely to be considerable. So I think the dominant feeling about the non-pharmaceutical interventions was skepticism, emphasizing the weak evidentiary basis and emphasizing the certainty of considerable costs. Just finally, the American Civil Liberties Union in 2008, in part because the Bush administration was talking about mandatory enforcement measures, put out a study opposing these measures, arguing that grafting the values of law enforcement and national security into public health is both ineffective and dangerous. Too often, fears aroused by disease and epidemics have justified abuses of state power. Coercion and brute force gratuitously breed public distrust and encourage the people most in need of care to evade public health authorities. Strategies that rely on voluntary participation do work. People engage willingly in any and all efforts to keep their families and communities healthy. And finally, minorities and other socially disadvantaged populations tend to bear the brunt of tough public health measures. And this is especially notable, I think, in part because the American Civil Liberties Union was entirely silent during COVID, including about the measures that we now know, communications from the Biden administration to the social media companies, surreptitiously telling them to de-boost messaging at odds with government policy and to boost messages in support of government policy, practices that Mark Zuckerberg and others have subsequently renounced, but was widespread for years. American Civil Liberties never submitted a brief in the case of Missouri versus Biden. All right, so early 2020, I mean, that's kind of background, pre-COVID background. But early 2020, policy turned on a dime. Some scholars have called it a kind of reverse domino effect. The Chinese strategy proved extremely influential around the world. What happened and why? Well, the Wuhan lockdown came on January 22nd, 2020, the largest quarantine in human history to that point. 60 million people in Hebei province and some neighboring ones under lockdown. Sort of a staggering thing at the time that was a departure from pre-COVID practice. And initial reactions to the Wuhan were skeptical. Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of the National Institute for Allergic and Infectious Diseases, said a couple of days later, that's something I don't think we could possibly do here in the United States. I can't imagine shutting down New York or Los Angeles. But the judgment on the part of the Chinese health authorities that this is something that in fact is going to help containing it. Whether it does or does not is really open to question, because historically, when you shut things down, it doesn't have a major effect. The World Health Organization, however, sent a team to China at the end of January to study the Chinese situation. They spent 1 week there. The team included 15 Chinese scientists and another 15 scientists from other countries, including 2 from the United States. They came back and fulsomely endorsed the Chinese strategy. They said that China had succeeded in containing the virus, suppressing the virus, and they advocated that every country in the world should adopt the Chinese strategy, regardless of the fact that the Chinese were able to employ measures that many countries could not possibly employ, bolting people into their apartments and so on, and mandatory use of social media apps to trace people's movement. But in any case, the WHO report said the Chinese had demonstrated that this virus can be suppressed and controlled. Aggressive case identification, extreme social distancing. This can work in any setting, even in African countries, which are very young and where people are very tightly packed, like Johannesburg and some other places. They're recommended for every country in the world. The other thing that happened at this time was the head of the World Health Organization estimated that the death rate from COVID was 3.4%. Now it was known that was misleading, because early on, we knew who was getting sick from COVID, very sick from COVID, I should say, people that were showing up in emergency rooms or doctor's offices. But there were many people that were getting cold or flu-like symptoms or mild symptoms that didn't show up to the office. So we knew the numerator, but not the denominator. We know how many people were getting sick, but we didn't know how many people had the virus and not gotten particularly sick or not gotten very sick. So everyone knew that was a wild overestimate, but that was still circulated widely and was very frightening. The actual death rate from COVID was around 0.25, 0.27%. So that's much lower than that. Still, it was a bad virus. It was no question. Now, the other things that happened on March 16th, what was called the bombshell report came out of Imperial College London. Neil M. Ferguson, who was one of the original mathematical modelers who had been involved in those model studies during the Bush administration, put out a report, Report 9 from Imperial College. And this had been sent to the Trump administration in draft form the week before. And the final report was sent to Trump on March 16th. And that's the day he held a news conference, held up documents, and recommended school and business closures and social distancing in places where there was community outbreak. The report, again, modeled projections about how many people in a worst case scenario would die from COVID. It was a worst case scenario, but it was reported as a prediction. And in some ways, the rhetoric of the report sort of encouraged that. But they predicted the possibility of 2.2 million dead Americans by August 2020 if we didn't impose this whole suite of measures, and 500,000 in the UK, along with healthcare systems being overwhelmed many times over. So this was an extremely influential report, reported around the world, and its graphs and so on had a major effect on Trump administration and others. Ferguson had a long time track record of over predicting the consequences of pandemics, but no matter, he exercised a lot of influence in this case. Now, just to emphasize, there was early dissent from the lockdown measures in March as they started to be imposed. Tom Frieden, the former director of the Center for Disease Control, we must consider this is March 16th, same day. We must consider the huge cost huge societal costs of closing schools against what may be little or no health benefit. Dr. David Katz from Yale, March 20, New York Times, is our fight against coronavirus worse than the disease? I'm deeply concerned that the social, economic, and public health consequences of this near total meltdown of normal life, schools and businesses closed, gatherings banned, will be long-lasting and calamitous, possibly graver than the direct toll of the virus itself. Worse, I fear that our efforts will do little to contain the virus. Dr. Michael Osterholm from the University of Minnesota, one of the world's leading epidemiologists. If governors close schools with few cases, how will they reopen with more cases? And quoting him, we've got people literally just following each other off the edge of a cliff because they're not thinking. Again, Osterholm and Michael Olshaker of the New York Times, the Washington Post, excuse me, on March 21st, 2020. Hong Kong closed schools, Singapore did not. There was hardly any difference in the rate of transmission. School closures harm essential workers, the least able to care for homebound children, healthcare professionals, firefighters, police officers, utility workers, delivery drivers, the 1/3 of workers who had to keep working in person right through the pandemic to keep our electricity on, the food being processed, the food being delivered, public services running, and so on. The best alternative probably is letting those at low risk for serious disease continue to work while advising higher risk individuals to protect themselves through physical distancing and ramping up our healthcare capacity. We could then gradually build up herd immunity, natural from infection and recovery, by natural infection and recovery without harming millions of school children and others. This was soon anathematized as public messaging. So tolerance for dissent waned over the spring and summer. I mean, basically what we find is a wartime framing was adopted. People declared war on COVID. And as in previous wars, the pursuit of truth was an early casualty. Dissent was seen as disloyal. And in a public health emergency, you need everyone to be on the same, you need compliance. And so dissent was seen as undermining compliance and against the public interest. And the wartime, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, the main medical advisor on CNN, World War C, Deborah Birx's book, Silent Invasion, Lessons from the COVID War. This was also true at Harvard Saffer Center, which did an early national report and national recommendations on COVID. They gathered people from all the professional schools and so on, and put out dozens of white papers, and then did a national planning document recommending a suppression strategy that we should test, trace, and supportively isolate to suppress the virus. They got the support of foundations that usually don't take policy positions, Rockefeller, New America, Santa Fe, and the Niskanen Center, kind of Central Libertarian Center. And they all agreed to sign on because in this time of national crisis, we need universities civil society institutions, journalists, and the government to all be on the same page, uniting on a common strategy. The American Enterprise Institute put out a national plan that was very similar to these. So, I'm skipping over some time periods here, but there were still dissenters. But by the fall, dissent was much less welcome, and people had to be braver to express dissent in public. So the three scientists, Martin Kulldorff from Harvard, Sunitra Gupta from Oxford, Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford, had started communicating over the summer and got together at a think tank in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, the American Institute for Economic Research. It is a kind of free market think tank, but frankly, I've read some of the stuff by the guys there, and they did some very good work. In any case, we'll go into that issue in a moment. But they essentially said what Michael Osterholm had said in March, and what the other scientists I quoted were saying in March. The most compassionate approach that balances the risks and benefits of reaching herd immunity, taking into account the costs of school closures for children, the costs of business closures, not just for people's economic well-being, but for their personal well-being, etc. Balances the costs and benefits is to allow those who are at minimal risk of death to live their lives normally, to build up immunity to the virus through natural infection, while better protecting those who are at highest risk. We call this focused protection. You could argue with it, argue against it, but it was not a crazy proposal given the cost of these measures, and it should have been taken seriously. But it was anathematized. Francis Collins, head of the National Institutes of Health, the biggest healthcare funding agency in the world for public health science, sent an email to Anthony Fauci and others saying this proposal from the three fringe epidemiologists seems to be getting a lot of attention. There needs to be a quick and devastating published takedown of its premises as an underway. And this message was circulated to journalists and various scientists and others. And he said to the Washington Post, this is a fringe component of epidemiology. This is not mainstream science, it's dangerous. In other newspaper articles, they said, these people are their advice is gonna cost lives. Dr. Greg Gonsalves at the Yale School of Public Health actually had said things very similar to Osterholm and so on in March. But I quote him because it gives a flavor of how intense the feelings were at the time. He's a professor at the Yale School of Public Health. He offered to assist Collins. And then his tweets subsequently include the following. I'm in my mid-50s. I have HIV. I saw my friends die in droves in the 80s and 90s. I have no more fucks left to give, except those peddling pseudoscience bankrolled by right-wing libertarian assholes can kiss my queer ass. I know you're kind. We beat you once. We will again. And again, this fucking Great Barrington Declaration is a bad rash that just won't go away. As I say, these tweets have been removed from Twitter, but they were up there for quite a while. Now, libertarians, they did, as I said, they met at Great Barrington, which was a free market think tank, but Sunitra Gupta is on record supporting the Socialist Party in the UK. And Martin Kulldorff, wrote in the socialist magazine Jacobin, saying elites have seen their stock portfolios balloon in value. It's the country's poor and working class households, particularly those with children, who are born a disproportionate share of the burden. Lower income Americans are much more likely to be forced to work in unsafe conditions, to have lost their livelihoods due to business and school shutdowns, and to be unable to learn remotely. Just as in the pre-COVID pandemic plans, it turns out that the costs were borne disproportionately by poorer people. So it's not, call that libertarian if you want. I guess bleeding heart libertarianism is one of the schools of thought in any case. All right, so pandemic policy making across the United States. That's just a slice into the discussion of the debate and a shift over the course of time. What happened in the states, and what were the policies that were adopted, and what were the consequences? Well, governors were the primary decision makers, as I said to the students at lunch, but they had to make decisions under great uncertainty. The coronavirus task force became a clearinghouse for information and for recommendations, but it was mainly an advisory role. Early in the pandemic, school closures and other restrictions spread across the whole country. Mike DeWine was the first governor to close schools statewide in March 12th, 15th, something like that. And so there was a sort of consensus early on a short period of closures. What happened was that heading into May and June, and especially over the summer, the policy divide widened along partisan grounds, with Democratic states imposing much longer interventions, restrictions on businesses, school closures in particular, much longer than Republican states. So Democratic governors issued stay-at-home orders faster, and kept them in place longer than Republican governors. The blue bar at the bottom is Democratic states, 2.5 times as long length of stay-at-home orders as Republican states. All public schools were closed nationwide by March 25th, as I said, and schools in Republican states generally reopened in the fall of 2020, as in Europe, as in Western Europe. But half the public schools in the US were still closed in March 2021, principally in Democratic states, which were closed much longer. So look, if we look at state partisanship and school reopening, the most Democratic jurisdictions on the right, District of Columbia, most Republican on the left, Wyoming, strong relationship between school reopening and partisanship. That's a very steep curve. Overall stringency index, Oxford very usefully came up with this overall stringency index for COVID interventions and included these 9 items, and they rated governments around the world based on how stringent their overall index of interventions was. Very helpful. School closures, workplace closures, restrictions on gatherings, stay-at-home requirements, restrictions on movement, and so on. So if you look at state partisanship and overall pandemic restrictions, again, very strong relationship between greater Democratic partisanship on the right and much tougher overall pandemic restrictions, Republican states on the left. State partisanship and COVID restrictions over time, Democratic states were consistently more stringent than Republican states, the blue bars, Democratic states, the red bars, Republican states. And in a way, so anyway, Democratic states were consistently more stringent than Republican states throughout the pandemic. Now, the other thing that diverged was partisanship and vaccine uptake. Republican states also had more vaccine hesitancy. And so there was a pretty strong relationship there too, with the Democratic states to the right having higher vaccine uptake. That's Vermont, Rhode Island up there, Wyoming, and so on, the lowest levels of vaccine uptake on the left. So the punchline is, well, it's a big COVID policy divide based on political party. And I should say my colleague and co-author Francis Lee put this part of the book together, these numbers. With what results? Vaccine uptake did have a relationship with COVID mortality for sure. The more highly vaccinated states have markedly lower rates of COVID mortality in the post-vaccine period. This is post-vaccine period. Again, the Democratic states are on the right. So the vaccines did have a measurable comparative impact across the states. But the other measures not. Earlier stay-at-home orders not associated with lower COVID mortality. Lengthier stay-at-home orders not associated with lower COVID mortality, no relationship. School closures and COVID mortality, no relationship, and they diverge quite widely. States with less in-person schooling did not fare better in terms of COVID mortality than states with more in-person schooling. All pandemic restrictions, that Oxford index and mortality, no relationship. There's just no relationship that we can find statistical significance between the restrictions and lower mortality. Thomas Bolicki at the University of Washington used a different database and came up with the same findings. All of those black bars are within the margins of error. Only the 2 red bars are outside the margin of error, and they apply to vaccine mandates for school employees and state employees. So that, again, he finds that the vaccines had a measurable effect on mortality, others did not. He says we're misusing his research findings, but these were his research misfindings. Anyway. Now, studies of Europe, 29 states in Europe, they diverged even more widely than the United States in terms of restrictions. And this article of Pizzato et al., we think is the best of them. He compares mortality during COVID, all-cause mortality, with previous 10 years average and adjusted for age and other factors. Good social science does all these corrections for conflicting variables and so on, confounding variables. So take my word for it. This is a good study. Surprisingly, the authors say they found no relationship between the more stringent lockdown measures, school closures, and so on across Europe and COVID mortality. We find some relationship, a bit of a reduction in transmission, 25, maybe 20, 25% or something like that, but there's not an associated relationship with mortality. There are various reasons why that could be the case, and that's simply the state of the empirics at this point. We cannot reject the null hypothesis of no effect, to put it in social science lingo. Lessons learned. Well, governors did pretty well after COVID and during COVID, regardless of how their states were doing. California had the longest school closures. Gavin Newsom got reelected. Florida, DeSantis insisted that the schools be reopened in the fall. And of course, he won re-election too. So it was really popular. DeSantis, might have paid a political price had he been wrong. A lot of elderly people in Florida, but it turns out that California did no better than Florida. All right, costs. I'm going to go through this very quickly. We have a chapter on costs. I think we're just beginning to estimate the costs of the COVID restrictions, and they are many. First of all, the expenditures, just in fiscal terms, were enormous. And only 10% of these expenditures were for health-related expenses, public health, vaccines, and so on. 90% was for other matters, including paying for people's rent and giving them income supports as a consequence of the closures. So in 2020, the expenditures as a percentage of GDP were equal to the entire New Deal, which is on the right there as a percentage of GDP, the 5 years of the New Deal, plus the 2009 Recovery Act put together, just in 1 year. And in 2021, we did the New Deal over again. So an enormous increase in the debt burden, which will be a burden on future generations to pay it back. Also probably contributed to the inflation that cost many governments around the world, the parties in power, their power. Unemployment went up much higher in the states that had more intense restrictions. So the blue states, competitive states, Republican states towards the bottom, much higher unemployment in Democratic states, and it persisted much longer. Republican states have gone below their pre-COVID pandemic levels. Democrat states have finally gotten back to around those levels. And the consequences of unemployment are lifelong and manifest themselves in health and well-being, not just economics. Effects on education: unprecedented drops in student learning in both reading and math. Chronic absenteeism doubled. It's now 1/3 of K-12 students nationwide. The reports keep coming out on this. The recent NAEP, National Association of Educational Progress, I'll have more information on this again. And the losses were greater in high poverty districts and for Black and Hispanic students, again, as the pre-COVID pandemic plans warned. Effects on physical and mental health were many. The delays in elective medical care followed by backlogs, rise in excess deaths, even in demographics little affected by COVID, surge in anxiety, depression, and eating disorders among children and adolescents, increase in substance abuse and overdose-related deaths. The biggest increase in crime in U.S. history, one year-over-year increase in homicides in U.S. history, concentrated in cities with more young men forced out of work in low-income neighborhoods. And the school closures may have contributed there too. At first, it was thought that was due to the killing of George Floyd and the protests around that, but it turns out the increases were preceded that in April. Effects on the social fabric: depopulation of downtown business districts. I mean, Washington is, hardly recovered in many ways. And I know federal workers are finally back and so on, but had a big impact here. San Francisco, some of the bluest cities have had the biggest impact on the West Coast. Depressed church attendance and volunteering, loneliness, and social isolation. So anyway, the costs need to be calculated because the costs were predicted, and the costs were largely were ignored to great an extent. So I want to shift now to another possible casualty of COVID, which is the tendency to code disagreement as misinformation or disinformation. And that persists, I think. It didn't start with COVID, but COVID exacerbated it. So I'm going to use as a kind of reference point, which you do here in the book, an article that appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association's Journal Network Open, called Public Health Communication of COVID-19 Misinformation on Social Media by Physicians in the U.S. Describes COVID information by doctors on their social media platforms, medical doctors, and to help government agencies and professional associations punish doctors who put COVID misinformation on their social media platforms. And it laments that few physicians appear to have faced disciplinary action on account of putting COVID misinformation on Facebook or Twitter or what have you. I won't go through the definitions of mis and disinformation. But now there was some legitimate misinformation that article singles out for sure. That maybe you got injected with a chip or something, by the vaccine, and over claims about the vaccine side effects. But here are 5 categories of things that were labeled misinformation by this article in August or July 2023, when we should have known better. Suggestions that natural infection and recovery contribute effectively to population level or herd immunity as well or better than vaccines. No one should have ever doubted that. Vaccines only mimic the effect of getting something and recovering from it. That's what they do. So that obviously was true. And in fact, calling it misinformation is itself misinformation. Government and public health officials withheld key information regarding COVID-19. I'll get to some particulars on that in a minute. clearly that turns out to be true. We knew it was true at the time. The virus originated in a Chinese laboratory, was part of a National Institutes of Health funded study, was leaked, and the leak was covered up by government and other public health officials. These were called conspiracy theories that should be punished if doctors articulated them. We'll get to that in a minute. That government actors were in contact with Twitter and other social media companies, telling them what to censor, and in many cases, who to censor regarding COVID-19 misinformation. By this time, the Missouri versus Biden case had already done the evidence on this had been published in the federal reporting. And this was clearly known to be true by the time this article was published and well before. And the evidence had been taken in the case. We'll get to that in a minute. And doubts about the effectiveness of masks and suggesting that masking imposed special costs on children. We'll get there too. So just to say, with respect to, infection acquired, or sometimes called natural immunity versus vaccines, there are a bunch of meta studies that show exactly what anyone would have predicted, that getting the virus and recovering from it gives you immunity, which fades, as do vaccines, but immunity just as good or maybe slightly better than vaccines. These are just studies of studies, and these were all available by the time this article came out. Natural immunity confers longer lasting and stronger protection according to that meta study. Natural efficacies would be equal or higher compared to individuals receiving 2 mRNA doses. Natural immunity to vaccines have similar findings and so on. So that clearly the consensus view. So that was wrong to suggest that. What happened was that there was a lot of messaging to this effect because they wanted people to wait for the vaccination. They didn't want anyone to sort of think, well, if I get the virus and recover from it, I'm young, I'm healthy, I won't be that sick, I'll then have some immunity. Well, fine, if you want to encourage people not to think that way, encourage them not to think that way, but don't lie to them. And don't tell them things that are palpably false, which, they also said that if you get, because the messaging in addition was, if you get the vaccine, you'll be a dead end to the virus. You won't pass it on. That was never an endpoint in the vaccine studies. That was sheer speculation. And that's not true, obviously, with influenza viruses. I mean, you get an influenza shot, you can still get influenza. It'll help, with the severity, but you can still get influenza and you can still pass it on to the people. And that had been the case with previous coronaviruses. So, but in fact, a lot of the scientific establishment was putting out its own misinformation on this topic. So, for example, in the spring of 2020, the World Health Organization's website correctly defined herd immunity as indirect protection from an infectious disease that happens when a population is immune either through vaccination or immunity developed from previous infection. That was changed over the summer on their website. By November 2020, I don't know the exact date, they said herd immunity, also known as population immunity, is a concept used for vaccination, in which a population can be protected from a certain virus if a threshold of vaccination is reached. That is misleading. But it's consistent with what I was saying, that the agenda here is discourage people from getting the virus. But this misinforms us. So tens of thousands of people got COVID, recovered, but were denied the comforting knowledge that they had some immunity. And that was also true of healthcare workers who would have felt more comfortable working in COVID wards if they knew that having had the virus, they had the equivalent immunity from getting multiple RNA shots. And people were denied that. That was harmful to people, not just lying to them. The public health officials withheld information on possible lab origin and NIH funding of COVID research. Well, so we have a chapter on this, and a little bit more than a chapter. Dr. Francis Collins, then director of the National Institute of Health, said in May 2020, neither the National Institutes of Health nor the National Institute of Allergic and Infectious Diseases, that's Dr. Fauci's agency, have ever approved any grant that would have supported gain-of-function research on coronaviruses that would have increased their transmissibility or lethality in humans. That's gain-of-function. The functions gained are transmissibility or lethality. And there are scientists that do research making viruses more transmissible and more dangerous. We can talk about why later on. In fact, and I'm quoting David Zweig on this, but we have a whole chapter, the National Institutes of Health gave millions of dollars to a nonprofit called EcoHealth Alliance, Peter Daszak, president. EcoHealth funded hundreds of thousands of dollars in subawards to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Grant applications to the National Institutes from EcoHealth explicitly spell out work involving the creation of deadlier or more transmissible pathogens. The researchers would use infectious clone technology and humanized mice. That sounds really creepy. They're mice whose lungs are engineered to be more like human lungs, so you can respiratory, to test the ability of newly created coronaviruses to infect humans. And this turns out to be well established. There are grant proposals we have from agents, from people to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, to the National Institutes of Health, purporting to create enhanced coronaviruses that appear to have the properties that the novel coronavirus had in January 2020. So in fact, there were scientists who studied these matters, and in January 2020, Christian Andersen was one of them, who came across an article. By this time, the genetic sequence of the virus had been published on the web. Scientists make these things public as soon as they have them. So they could see the genetic sequence of this novel virus. Andersen read a paper by a scientist at the Wuhan Institute of Virology as a co-author that described research to enhance coronaviruses. And it seemed to be in many of the ways that this genetic sequence was enhanced for its transmissibility in humans. So he found an academic paper that looked like a how-to manual for building the coronavirus in a laboratory. On January 30, Christian Andersen emails Dr. Edward Holmes, another virus expert, and says, Eddie, can we talk? I need to be pulled off a ledge here. And say we have these email and Slack messages for freedom of information requests. The pair knew of a laboratory where researchers had been experimenting on coronaviruses for years, namely the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Holmes' response, fuck, this is bad. People say I should take out the F-bombs, but that's how people are talking to each other. I don't want to airbrush this version. It's PG-13 or whatever. We have these emails and Jamie Farrar writes about them in his book on Spike. They communicate their belief in the lab origin of the virus to Anthony Fauci, Francis Collins, Jamie Farrar, the head of the Wellcome Trust in the UK, their biggest healthcare funding agency. And they immediately, Collins and the others say, we need to have a secure phone call. That phone call is arranged the next day with another dozen scientists included to talk about their suspicions and the grounds for them. We have a whole bunch of emails, but we don't have the record of a phone call. After hurriedly arranged phone calls, Andersen co-authors Holmes, Dr. Andrew Rambo, and others set out to write a paper called Proximal Origins of the Coronavirus that aimed not to air the evidence that formed the basis for their suspicions about a lab origin for the virus, but to debunk that theory. We have their Slack messages while writing the article. They were sending each other messages. These were gotten through Slack as an inter-office communication platform. These things have been subpoenaed through freedom of information requests. So Rambo, the main issue is that accidental escape is in fact highly likely. It's not some fringe theory. I absolutely agree that we can't prove it one way or the other. Perhaps we never will be able to. Andersen, although I hate it when politics is injected into science, but it's impossible not to, especially given the circumstance. Rambo, it would be a shit show if anybody seriously accused the Chinese of even accidental release. And Andersen said to a German scientist a couple of weeks later, our main work over the last couple of weeks has been focused on trying to disprove any type of laboratory origin, any type of lab theory. But Andersen on February 4th, and again in a private Slack message, the main thing in my mind is that the lab escape version of this is so friggin' likely. On May 21st, 2020, the fact is during this whole episode, Andersen's Institute had a grant proposal sitting on the desk of Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins. It was approved. On May 21, 2020, Andersen's lab secured a 1.9 million grant from the U.S. National Institutes of Health, Francis Collins director. Final decision was made by Dr. Fauci. Now, they fund all of the scientific research in the country, basically, so their power and influence over people is profound. I don't say that this was the direct motive or whatever, but that's simply a fact. Conflicts of interest, as Alan mentioned. Now, here's one. So February 21, 2025, Nature magazine put out an article, and this is the public-facing version of the serious scientific journal Nature. What sparked the COVID pandemic? Mounting evidence points to raccoon dogs, which is a kind of hedgehog dominating that market. And people catching the virus wild animal. They quoted 6 scientists in support. Christian Andersen and Edward Holmes, who we've just seen, that were on that phone call, and 4 of their co-authors. 4 of their co-authors for other articles. They cite and quote no one on the other side, as if this is the consensus. And of course, saying nothing about the various conflicts. And this is February 21, 2025. What I've just shown you has been in the public record for years. So Richard Ebright, who's a plain-spoken scientist at Rutgers, said this: the writer, the editor, and each and every person quoted in this article knows SARS-CoV-2 entered humans through a research incident. They are lying. They know they're lying. We know they're lying, and they know we know they're lying. I mean, April 4th, 2020, 97% of the French Academy of Sciences voted that the lab origin of COVID is entirely plausible. It's sometimes been reported as they voted in favor of a lab origin. I don't think they really did, but they certainly said 97.3%. I think this exaggerates the finding. From a lab error, it must be taken in the future revealed. What must be taken? Actions must be taken. I think they at least voted that it was an entirely plausible theory. 97.3%. So again, somehow in the United States, we're much more. These things are much more politicized than in other countries. All right, government officials telling social media execs what to censor and who to censor regarding COVID-19 information. This is from the Washington Post article, September 9, 2020. But the case was Murphy versus Biden. That was the appeal of Missouri versus Biden, which started earlier. And we have the emails. It turns out the Biden administration, but it started under the Trump administration. The FBI, I think, and other agencies, maybe the CDC, were contacting social media companies and telling them to algorithmically deboost messaging on Twitter, Facebook, and elsewhere, all social media, that were contradicting government policy, and to algorithmically boost messaging that supported government policy. This was done surreptitiously, and they threatened them with revocation, social media companies, of Section 230 protection, which is their protection against liability. Social media companies are not liable for things published on their platforms. They're not like the New York Times. The New York Times is liable if someone says something libelous about someone, according to the standard of the courts. Twitter and Facebook are not. They're not publishers, they're platforms. So that's necessary to their business model. In any case, the Court of Appeals ruled the Biden administration top government official at the FBI likely violated the First Amendment by improperly influencing tech companies' decisions. As I said, Mark Zuckerberg, other tech leaders have said, yes, this happened. Yes, we did it. Yes, we regret it. We won't do it again. Likely coerced them. It was reversed by the Supreme Court on grounds of standing, because the government said it wouldn't do it anymore. So it said that the plaintiffs didn't have a cause showing, damage in the future. So, but they didn't really reach the merits of the case. So it's clear that the government was in touch with social media companies to figure out this. Oh, this is a different one on masks. I'm going to skip over that. So there were controversies about masks, and basically it's the case that this is at the individual level, mask wearing may make sense, but there's an absence of evidence to suggest that mask mandates provide population level benefits at the collective level. It's just so this is from the Cochrane Library Analysis that did a revision of its study. It's done 5 studies on this before. On the right, N95 respirators as compared to medical surgical probably makes little or no difference to laboratory confirmed infections. The evidence is rated with moderate certainty. I think the mask debate was just highly politicized. As an individual decision, it's fine, but I think mask mandates were at least weakly supported by scientific evidence. Previous slide was a slide from Dr. Fauci being asked about masks in 2019, and he said, no, I don't have a basis for recommending them. Public health officials withholding important information. So this is just a quote from Francis Collins, the director of the National Institutes of Health. What I did was wrong because I had plenty of these moments in television interviews. We failed to say every time there was a recommendation, guys, this is the best we can do right now. It's a good chance this is wrong. We didn't say that. We wanted to be sure people actually motivated themselves by what we said, because we wanted change to happen in case it was right. But we did not admit our ignorance, and that was a profound mistake. We lost a lot of credibility along the way. So clearly, public health officials withheld important information about their ignorance, about the lack of their knowledge, and it's good that Collins admitted this. All right, why did we do it, and what should we learn? It's complicated, and in the book we try to tell the story, and we didn't spend a lot of time sort of trying to figure out why. So I think the why question is harder. But there was tunnel vision for sure. We talked about this with the students earlier. Public health officials focus narrowly on one outcome, reducing disease threat. They focus on nothing else. I mean, Collins says that himself, like there in a minute. I think there was a class bias. I think, to some degree, the policies were made by and for members of the laptop class. We were able to shelter at home, work on our computers, Zoom meetings, and so on and so forth, Zoom teaching, inferior but possible. Whereas a lot of other people had to keep working in person to allow us to keep doing that stuff. Science journalism and much of the academy were politicized, just not asking hard questions, not exhibiting the kind of skepticism that social sciences are supposed to exhibit when government officials claim, great policy success for policy measures. And there was insufficient humility, respect for dissent, and honesty exhibited on a wide range of institutions. So this is, again, on the tongue of his Francis Collins from that Braver Angels panel on July 23rd. If you're a public health person, you have this narrow view of what the right decision is, and that is something that will save a life. It doesn't matter what else happens. So you attach infinite value to stopping the disease and save a life. You attach a zero value to whether this totally disrupts people's lives, ruins the economy, and has many kids kept out of school in a way they never quite recover from. This is a public health mindset. And I think a lot of us involved in trying to make those recommendations had that mindset. I think this has been amply confirmed by others as well. Faulty leadership. Governor Cuomo in New York is back running for mayor. He exhibited the same kind of mindset. Frankly, I want to be able to say to the people of New York, I did everything we could do. And if everything we do saves just one life, I'll be happy. Not paying attention to the fact that there were costs on the other side, including in terms of lives. So he said on April 22nd, economic hardship. Yes, very bad, not death. Emotional stress from being locked in a house. Very bad, not death. Domestic violence on the increase. Very bad, not death. Well, we hope not death. He was given a special Emmy Award for his news conferences until it was taken back after women complained about his behavior. But he was a hero, I think, to those who saw him as the alternative to Trump. And yet what he's doing here is celebrating irrationality. Let's pay attention to the hope that lockdowns will save lives, and let's pay no attention to the costs of these measures. Likewise, journalists ignored policy trade-offs, narrowly focused on curbing virus spread. They routinely asked why more wasn't being done. This is Jim Acosta, I think, from CNN. Given what Governor Cuomo has done in New York, is there any more consideration to a national lockdown to keep people in their homes? They ignored CDC data. On April 8th, 2020, CDC did a report that had bad news and good news. The bad news was that African Americans and men were more at risk than other people. That was widely reported, but the report also said that children were at very low risk, and that finding wasn't reported at all, or reported very little. They ignored evidence of schools reopening safely across Europe in April and May 2020. I mean, a narrative drove media coverage as well as government decision making. Class bias. Again, costs were not considered and they were inequitably distributed. They fell harder on disadvantaged people. That was predicted in the pre-COVID pandemic plans. On the young, on racial and ethnic minorities, on low-wage workers, on small business owners, on people with disabilities who had a harder time, I think, with isolation and online learning. Pandemic policies were developed and imposed by people who suffered less from negative consequences. Pre-existing inequalities widened. And again, this was warned about. There was a lot of groupthink and mutual reinforcement of biases, we think. We went back to this book by Irving Janis from 1971 on groupthink, the wake of the Vietnam War, looking at educated people making dumb decisions, including Vietnam and other things. The belief in, the symptoms of groupthink include belief in the inherent morality of their approach. Excessive optimism encourages extreme risk-taking, failure to reconsider assumptions, to question assumptions, stereotyped views of outgroups, and self-censorship, failure to voice doubts, and a kind of illusion of unanimity. I think there was considerable groupthink at policy-making levels around these matters. And moral lessons, we need greater toleration of disagreement and respect for dissent. We need to recognize the importance of ideological and viewpoint diversity, including on these kinds of issues. Greater humility on the part of experts and elites. Greater honesty in acknowledging uncertainty, especially in public health. Greater openness and transparency in science and science journalism, and acknowledgement of conflicts of interest. And these are not rewarded in politics and communications ecosystems particularly, but they're the core virtues on which science, journalism, and the academy depend. I have one more slide from one of your colleagues here, so I'll go to that. I thought, is it David Barker et al.? What's that?
Where is he?
Yeah, I know. I talked to him before. He has a legitimate excuse. No, he wrote a piece called Intellectuals and Anti-Intellectualism, an Epistemic Universe. It's a very nice piece in the American Political Science Review. And he said, our data suggests that the growing intellectuals of Blue America and the spiking anti-intellectuals of Red America contribute to each side's convictions that they are uniquely endowed with knowledge and truth. So problems apply to both sides. That is, we observe that both intellectual identity and identity as an intellectual and anti-intellectual affect predict epistemic hubris, and that the former is disproportionately associated with Democrats, the latter is disproportionately associated with Republicans. And I love the last from this conclusion. In contemporary American culture, the three little words in the shortest supply may not be "I love you," but "I don't know." It's a very good piece. I know he has a book coming out on this topic. So let me conclude there. Look forward to any questions that you might have.
It is our custom to take questions first from students, so I'll let you figure out.
Can we get the microphone?
Oh, yeah. There we go.
I talked to many students before, or students.
So questions.
It appears to be no. Yes, true.
Can you talk a little bit about more about the Missouri v. Biden case? Because I saw it was decided by the Fifth Circuit, and just as someone who leans a little more liberal, I am a little hesitant of trusting their.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. This is a very conservative circuit. That's a very good question. There are 3 Republican appointees. They're conservative, but they generated a record. They generated a record of through subpoenas of these communications from federal officials to the social media companies. The record speaks for itself, I think. So I think the benefit of that case is the record that was generated. And the heads of social media companies, have all acknowledged that this took place. There's not really any contestation about the record. Biden administration officials angrily, Biden administration officials angrily contacting these companies saying, you have to do more, you have to take this down. Things are still circulating, threatening them with Section 230 revocation. And doing this surreptitiously. We didn't know about this. So we didn't know that the messaging we were getting, the feeds that we were getting in social media, the news that was being amplified and the news that was being muted had been subject to manipulation on account of government interventions. If the First Amendment in America stands for anything, it stands for the proposition that we should be suspicious of government attempts to manipulate, the flow of public information. And so I think the record speaks for itself, regardless of the fact, as you're correct, that this is a very conservative circuit. I think the record speaks for itself. You don't really need the opinions. Now, there's a legitimate question as to whether jawboning, as one might characterize it, constitutes coercion. And there are other cases that they're looking at. The Supreme Court went into a bit of this, and so that's a legitimate question. Did this jawboning, this pressuring of companies, it went beyond persuasion. I mean, they weren't just making arguments saying, hey, here's this really good evidence, on these matters. Maybe you should, adjust this in light of this evidence. No. They were saying, this is again, and actually in some cases, again, this is the record. Social media executives would come back and say, well, wait a minute, this stuff you're telling us to suppress is true. And there were instances in which the government officials said, we know it's true, but it's unhelpful. So no, really, there's a reporting on the fact that there were some vaccine side effects. And so true information was also suppressed, and that's part of the record. So I would just say, read the record. You're right that there is a partisan inflection here, and on the Supreme Court, it was Justice Alito that thought they should have gone to the merits, and he again laid out a lot of the evidence in the record. But again, I think the record just speaks for itself. And Alito has not always been the most protective of free speech on the Supreme Court. But good question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I read the book before this, and when I was going through it, I liked your elaboration on how kind of, even though there was a consensus that lockdowns wouldn't have a significant effect before the pandemic, everyone saw that China reported, we locked everything down and we're having success with it. And that was taken by a lot of Western intellectuals at face value with no questioning.
There's also this group that went to China. And
yes, the group.
They were, again, ushered around by the Chinese authorities. One of the little facts that's in the book, is that they got to meet with the Chinese scientists in public meetings. They weren't allowed to travel with the Chinese scientists. So it was kind of interesting that there was a bit of sequestration going on for whatever reason. The Chinese scientists were transferred on one bus, and the West non-Chinese were transferred on another bus. Anyway, yes.
Anyways, yeah. My question is, I was reading through the segment on masks and mask mandates, and I didn't really understand, where did that part of COVID policy arise from, and how did that become kind of the most visceral visual image of the pandemic era, of everyone wearing a mask, even though now that there's been more research, it's inconclusive that the a lot of the masks that we had weren't actually able to protect against respiratory viruses. People just kind of had an assumption that because they might protect against like saliva and spit and whatever, that would protect them.
I think it was a very visible symbol of concern. I think it became a very visible symbol of concern for others as it was. Yeah. So I think that's what happened. Now, I think it was admirable sentiment behind it, and we go through this because there were two warring op-eds in the New York Times. My now colleague at Princeton in sociology, Zeynep Tufekci, published an op-ed or opinion piece with this title. The editors may have given it the title, but the science is clear, masks work. She misrepresented some of the research there. I mean, we write about this in the book. There were two COVID studies, one in Bangladesh and one in Denmark, I think it was, and both studies were corrupted. The authors had to acknowledge too many people dropped out of the study for the results that they regarded as significant, but she sort of suggested otherwise. And then Brett Stevens wrote a piece, the more conservative journalist, saying the science is not clear. And I think he basically got it right, and he said, individual decisions to wear a mask out of caution and wearing them conscientiously is perfectly fine, but mask mandates are not well supported. And they're the Cochrane reports. I mean, I have colleagues, in economics who say the Cochrane report is bullshit. It's hard to do randomized studies. They consider randomized controlled studies to be the gold standard, where you have populations who are controlled. That's what they tried to do in Bangladesh and this other study. And it didn't work out. Too many people dropped out and so on. And he comes to the conclusion that the mask mandates had a weak justification, but individual decisions to wear masks, were fine. And but you're right that surgical. One of my colleagues in sociology, when we showed him a draft chapter, first said, "Why do you want to go down this rabbit hole?" And then said, "I want Brett Stevens to tell his surgeon next time he has surgery not to bother to wear a surgical mask." That is, as you said, to prevent blood spattering in your mouth or sneezing in a wound or something. It's not about viruses, but anyway. Yeah. Yeah.
To what degree would you attribute the original perceived improvement in the spread of coronavirus in China to simply underreporting?
I'm sorry, give me that again. I didn't quite hear.
To what degree would you contribute the perceived improvement in COVID spread in China after their initial lockdown measures to simply the CCP underreporting cases?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know how much you're asking me. In part, do I think the Chinese Communist Party underreported cases? I don't know. There is evidence that there were more. Well, at some points when they reopened, certainly there was some evidence that there was more activities around hospitals and varying places that suggest there were more cases that were being reported. Again, my colleague, I talked about this in economics, who does a lot of public health, thinks that the Chinese data is unreliable. They did very severe lockdown measures. They required everyone to use apps. They required, they managed to track people. They literally bolted people into their homes. I mean, there's some evidence that they were shooting people's pets and so on. I mean, but the bolting people to their homes was reported, as we say, before the team went over there. So they certainly undertook measures, and there are surveillance, measures that are beyond the capacities of many governments in the world and beyond the willingness of many governments in the world. So it's a little hard to. I guess it was able to. I gave some talks in China in October 2020. It was before our election, so I talked about the election in the American political system and so on. They didn't want me to talk about COVID too much, and I actually changed that. I did use that slide in some Zoom things. I changed it to foreign laboratory from Chinese laboratory. But anyway. I didn't meet people there that thought that the Chinese approach had been great. Students there who lived through the lockdowns and so on, they look back with horror, at their experience. I had friends there who were, teaching in China, and they just didn't know they worried that they would starve. They just wouldn't get enough food. People were locked into their big apartment buildings and so on, and they were not confident that they would have enough food and water to survive. So it's hard to weigh the costs and benefits of these things. I do think that it's probably right that the data being reported by the Chinese probably aren't reliable.
I just wanted to ask, who do you think should be responsible for making the decision and weighing like the benefit of the good of the people compared to the sacrifice you might have to make, risk. Because if the public health officials are oftentimes not concerned with anything except viral spread, and oftentimes politicians are only concerned with getting reelected and doing things to get themselves reelected. I just want to know how you think, and how do you think that should be handled, and who do you think should handle it?
Yeah, well, I'll say one thing. That's a very good way to put it. It's a very good question. It's a very good way to put it. You know, it is a fact and a heuristic in a lot of social science research that, you know, let's assume that the only interest that politicians have is in being reelected, and you can actually explain a lot of what happens on that basis, and that is unfortunately uppermost. But I mean, we do count on public officials to exhibit a little more. There's no way a constitutional system works if the only thing you care about is power, retaining power. I mean, that's another way of looking at elections. If that's your only interest, if it's, do you care that the elections are fair? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. If your main interest is in keeping power through the elections, is your main interest the outcome or the process? You know, that's also liable to be corrupted. So they read the Federalist Papers and other accounts. There's no account of American democracy, including by people like Morris B. Arena, the studies of Congress that assume they analyze the behavior of Congress people and find that you can explain a lot of what happens in Congress, most of what happens in Congress, maybe 90% of what can, just by assuming that they want to win re-election with structured committees and so on. But even, you know, Fiorina, David Mayu, and others who've done these studies say they have to be people that are committed to the health of the institution, to keep the institutional norms, you know, in place and running and so on. And I think that's true of our politics more generally. There's no account of our politics I know of that does completely without virtue. At least caring about the long term, caring about the health of the system, caring about fairness, and that's true of the scientific process. That's true of the constitutional system. So I would say the people that make decisions ought to be public officials who are responsible for the public good. We have to accept the fact that yes, they're going to be averse to risk, and they're going to, you know, be thinking about what they can defend in public, what they're allowed to take heat for, and so on. And so we have to allow that. But at some point, we should hope that they are also willing to make judgments, you know, that's worth it. So Ron DeSantis, as I said, I think earlier, during COVID, called in the three epidemiologists I mentioned, I think Kudorf and Bhattacharya and another one. And he listened to them, he read their papers, they've said, and others have said, and he decided that schools in Florida should be reopened in the fall across the state. As I said earlier, he might have taken flack for that. A lot of old people in Florida, if that had helped to spread the virus, he could have taken a big political hit, but it turned out to be the right call. And there were other governors, I think, who did that too. But it's public officials responsible for the public good who should be making these decisions. Now, maybe committees can be set up that are more representative of a greater diversity of experts. That probably would be helpful. I mean, what we say at the end of the book is something we need more checking and balancing. We need more diverse elites to check public health elites. More economists should have been involved. Probably should have been more viewpoint diversity. That UK committee that I mentioned, Dingwall, the sociologist, he said they made sure in that committee that there were not a majority of public health people and epidemiologists because they wanted the committee to be based on representing a broad view. So there probably are ways of structuring deliberation that would be better than what we had. That's a very good question. And another one back here too.
So am I too close to the mic or no? Okay. Big picture question here. It strikes me that it's very easy for those in the advanced degree holding secular suburban classes to say, you know, we've learned from COVID, we're not going to go back. If another pandemic hits, we will not sequester ourselves and take sort of bureaucratic rulings. But from what you've said, it seems like the actual in the moment decisions of COVID come down more to moral panic than actually trusting any data. Who's to say that another big scary virus hits, it's not just going to fall down the same lines of moral panic?
I don't have a magic ball. I don't crystal ball, excuse me, or magic ball. I can't predict the future. I mean, I do think that people have registered to a greater degree, to some degree at least, the cost of these measures. The cost of school closures in particular seem to be much more widely acknowledged and hard to ignore. Fiscal costs are probably going to be acknowledged too. So hopefully there's plenty to be learned there. It's not encouraging that there are so few academic conferences. As I said, I know of no law school conferences on the issue of Missouri versus Biden. I've talked to law professors at like Northwestern and so on who teach constitutional law. They hardly have ever heard of the case of Missouri versus Biden. Kind of weird. And it's also strange to me that the ACLU never filed the case, you know. One would hope that we'll learn, but it remains to be seen. Student over here, yeah.
So growing up and going through the COVID pandemic, I definitely, coming to this talk and reading your book, fell victim to just blindly following.
North Carolina, you said.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so I grew up in Chapel Hill, very liberal leaning town. I just certainly followed blindly the rulings and
It did too at the time. I should say I came to these views through the research. I was bleaching my groceries, yeah, that's what you'll leave them outside for 48 hours or something. You have a sterilization table where everything gets bleached down and goes into a separate container from the grocery store. So yes, I mean, this is a research-based book, but I was compliant early on too.
yeah, and I'm if you don't mind me asking the big question, how could you or how do you suggest that we reduce polarization in our current political climate?
Boy, that's the $50 million or whatever, $50 billion question. I think it's I think part of it is, I think there's a lot of sentiment about this. We're seeing kind of a reset in universities, I think now, and I think it's probably a good thing. Just trying to be more open to the other side, recognizing that all the truth is not on one side of the political spectrum. I would hope that there would be more of that. I think that that's partly the agenda of various centers at universities. I think that's a good thing. I've had this view about various issues for a while. I used to be more of a conservative, and I've been a Democrat, and we say in the book that we're progressive. That was probably a strategic move, but anyway, but that's basically true. I just think we need to be more self-critical, and I don't know. As an academic, I find it sort of interesting to work on those issues where it seems like most people that I know who are academics are not getting it quite right. So there's very interesting research opportunities there. There are other issues I think on which we could use more pushback. As I mentioned, there's a book by Stephen Koonin with a K, K-O-O-N-I-N, which is on climate change issues. He's a former professor at Caltech and former provost of Caltech. I have not read the book carefully, but it's not skeptical about climate change, not skeptical about human contributions, but it is skeptical that the measures, policies that have been recommended have been subjected to sufficient cost-benefit analysis. So it's called unsettled in terms of what we should do, and some of the science he thinks is unsettled too. There are other issues too where I think there's just too much of a progressive consensus, and it should be disrupted. We don't do ourselves any favor. I mean, if we want to go about adopting the best policies, we need to hear the criticisms from the other side and be open to insights from the other side. In our polarized environment, that's very tough. I guess I found one of the things very helpful. A lot of the research was based on Substacks and so on, and people that are publishing in Substacks or online rather than the New York Times and mainstream journals. As I mentioned before, there's this organization called U.S. Right to Know that did these amazing freedom of information requests and compiled all this stuff incredibly well. They deserve a Pulitzer Prize, in my opinion. I would recommend checking out the website of U.S. Right to Know. And there are some others that's like kind of responsible reporting from the other side. I make a point of trying to do that. I will say when Trump got elected the first time, I sort of decided every night I watch the news, I'm going to watch Fox News part of the time. It's a lot of bullshit on Fox News, but it's a lot of bullshit on MSNBC too. So it's good to have it balanced. So I mean, I do think that. I mean, it's important to hear the other perspective. And yeah, is that a question, or are you just going to be quiet?
So, thank you, the mic. Well, I think you're too kind to say that, but the stuff about the social media platforms is like a clear precedent for the FCC commissioner trying to get Jimmy Kimmel off the network.
Very good point.
And if we forget that, I'm sorry, like we are not clear. This is exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
Right. So, but I want to ask an epistemic question, which is this. So let's say folks in blue states, and, I live in Maryland, so I'm very familiar with this, put a very high value on safety. Right?
Yeah.
Well, I can understand where that comes from a moral point of view. Folks in red states put a very high, like their prior was a high premise on high value on liberty and not, anti-authoritarianism. One could say folks like DeSantis, from the data that you show, got it correct, got it quote unquote right. But you might say, well, their premise happened to be in accord with what actually happened. It was not actually superior insight.
Right.
It just so happened their premise was borne out, their priors were borne out.
Right.
And the other priors were not. Could you, so in a way that they sort of look better by accident.
Okay,
I have-
don't forget those pre-COVID pandemic plans that I mentioned, but anyway, that's fine.
But I'm just trying to get at the question.
Yeah, fair enough.
Like the
Yeah.
epistemic thing of
Yeah,
how is it, because we all have priors.
yeah, no, it's a very good point. I mean, it reminds me of Mencken, H.L. Mencken had a line about democracy. The democracy is the theory that the people know what they want and they should get it hard, risk averse or not, whatever it is. So I think people's views, partly were shaped by the media environment. So for instance, the gross overestimations that were carried in the media of people's risks. I talked about this a little bit at lunch. I mean, people's estimates of their risk from COVID were vastly overstated. People's estimates of other people's risks were vastly overstated, of children's risks and so on. And that's partly the result of conscious misinformation campaigns. So it goes beyond what I've said. In the UK, the BBC was in touch with, the government advisory groups were in touch with the BBC. We have the emails telling them young people are being lulled into complacency by the low mortality rates in their demographic. We need tough messaging. We need to ramp up the fear level, and they complied. Dr. Sanjay Gupta, in the book that I put up there on World War C, he starts off the book with 4 cases of people who died from COVID. One got seriously ill. A 40-year-old who ran marathons and so on and so forth. A 30-year-old mother who 4 very, very healthy young people. And there were such cases, but they're extremely rare. But that's the way that he introduces the book, not to introduce rare cases, but to introduce the whole discussion. And those are the only 4 cases he used to introduce the discussion. And this was very common. So public opinion to some extent was based on, I think, very bad reporting. And it did shift in Europe to a greater extent. So Mark Woolhouse wrote a very good book, Scottish epidemiologist, called The Year the World Went Mad. He makes it clear, I think, there was more learning in the UK over the summer. European countries, again, reopened their schools in April and May, in many cases. They were generally open in the fall. They were much more like Republican states than Democratic states. So I think, I hear you on that. And it's true that these policies were popular in these various places. But I think some of it was just based on very bad reporting and misperception.
Don't take this the wrong way, but your presentation, I have to echo Alan, just really made me sick.
I take that as a great compliment. As long as they'll give you a fever.
One thing that has long puzzled me was just why we weren't more curious about the incidence and severity. I mean, we could have done a random.
Yeah.
And got that data.
Yeah, I know. Well,
But we have this mortality rates that's estimated like 10 or 12, 15 fold or whatever.
Yeah.
Why didn't we get the data?
So Bhattacharya, who's now directing that, he was saying the same thing. Why aren't we going out and testing people to see how many people have gotten the virus in the population? Maybe didn't get sick, so we know. And John Ioannidis at Stanford said the same thing. The government wasn't doing it though, so Bhattacharya got some graduate students together. He's an economist, health economist, but writes a lot in health. Got some graduate students together, his wife, and they went to supermarket parking lots and started testing people there. And they, argued, my God, the prevalence was 15 or 20 times, higher in the population than the estimates suggested. Now that led them to make an overestimate in the opposite direction, that it was at least possible that COVID mortality rates would be maybe maximum 80,000 deaths in the country, something like that. And they put that in the Wall Street Journal, I bet. But they did say that was the lower bound. But they were no more out of whack on the optimistic side than the World Health Organization was on the pessimistic side. So, and they clearly had the right intuition that we should have been gathering the data called seroprevalence studies. So it's totally bizarre, totally bizarre. And there's no good reason for it that I know of. And again, Ioannidis, Stanford played a big role here. And they did have dissenters there. They also played a big role, and they had a dissenter who was censured by the Senate faculty. Scott Atlas, who went to work in the Trump administration, who wrote pieces for The Hill, that were skeptical about the lockdowns. He did do one thing that was very ill-considered. When Michigan was reimposing its lockdown measures, and they were very tough there, he sent out a tweet, and this was after Gretchen Whitmer had been threatened or something. He sent out a tweet saying, the people of Michigan should rise up. And some people said, he's calling for violence. He immediately sent out another tweet saying, I'm not calling for violence. I would never, all caps, call for violence. People of Michigan, contact your representatives, write emails to your representatives. I never call for violence and so on. So they cited that in the censure motion. But they also cited that he was out of his lane, that he's not an expert in epidemiology. He had written 5 textbooks on public health, and he could read statistics. And frankly, a lot of these studies are just about reading how good the data is and so on. And he was very good at that. And the people that brought the censure motion in the Stanford Faculty Senate were 2 professors of theater and performance studies, and someone else, I think comparative literature. There was 1 person from medical school who was a psychiatrist. So they're essentially. So I think that was also appalling. I'm going to go talk out Stanford.
Still sick.
You can find that. So we have a discussion at Stanford, Stanford online, but they also had dissenters and so on. Bhattacharya was at Stanford, Ionitis was at Stanford, and there were others. Probably associated with the Hoover Institution, but yeah, somebody else in the back.
You talk a bit in your book about how COVID just shows like some of like the issues that we have like currently in our liberal democracy, whether it be polarization or especially how it disproportionately affect impoverished people. What are some things that you think we can learn that we can implement in policy that if like some type of pandemic like this happened again, we would be better prepared and have better support?
Yeah.
Especially for people who may not have the ability to like support themselves if something like this hit again?
That's a very good question. So my colleague, Frances Lee, who's my co-author, studies Congress. And she is an excellent scholar. She's coming out with a book on Congress as representative of the public. I think the House of Representatives in particular. And we talk about an essay by Louis Anthony Dexter from 1965, his Congress and politics scholar, called Congress, Check and Balance. And he emphasizes there the value of members of the House who represent more the perspectives of ordinary people. You know, they're not the elite body like the Senate and so on. You know, they're still overrepresent the educated classes, but at least they represent ordinary people. Of checking and questioning experts, even if they're doing it in part to like make a name for themselves back home or to get themselves in the news. He said that still has value because they're capable of like getting the experts to be clear about their assumptions. And also they're apt to represent the views of more ordinary people, the concerns of ordinary people. So I think we should not discount the ways in which the House of Representatives, even though you point to individuals there, you know, on the right, depending on who you are, or who you think are irresponsible, but they represent constituencies, and in order to represent the public as a whole, you need those kinds of voices, frankly, so I think Congress could play a greater role. Legislatures in general could have played a greater role. They were out of you know, they were not in session enough. In general, I think our elected officials should play a greater role. And there may be, again, deliberative institutions that could represent the views of ordinary people. The thing with public health is it's never going to work unless there's compliance. You know, there has to be buy-in, you know, kind of sociological legitimacy, compliance, not just, you know, good justifications. So I think there's a strong case there, too, to make sure the voices of ordinary people are heard. And again, you know, it's important that to understand the cost of these measures, we have to understand them from the perspective of those who have to bear the cost, you know, and that's the public at large. So there might be some deliberative ways too in which, you know, citizen juries or something, I don't know, could help to bring some of that to bear. But in the first instance, the House of Representatives and the Senate should be engaging in oversight.
Maybe I'll ask a last question. What attitude do you want us to take away towards science, right? So postmodern thinkers, Michel Foucault has been arguing for a long time that science is BS. It's all made up. It's all political. Although he encourages, therefore, scientists to be political with their science in their realm. Have you concluded that science itself is just all BS?
No, I haven't. Again, we try to be social scientists. We try to be good social scientists here and report accurately. You know, I believe in basic liberal values, you know, classic, and Millian values of free speech and openness to dissent, and the values of science being open to dissent and criticism. I mean, there were too many episodes where, and this is in public health. Apparently, it's very strong. And actually, there's a very good book on this by Gil Eyal, E-Y-A-L, called "The Crisis of Expertise." And one of the things he argues is, look, you know, science has there's no such thing as science, really. There's pure science, it's research, and maybe they're better than some other people at being open to more criticism because it's pure research. But there's also science in the realm of policy advice. And one of the things he points out is that once scientists make policy advice and a policy gets adopted, there's a tendency to expect people to coalesce behind it. And so that may be part of what happened. But I've talked to people in public health, And I don't know public health from the inside well enough, but I've been told, and this is really consistent with what we see, that in public health there's a very strong sense of people in that field that the public doesn't really understand. You know, that they need to be told what to do, and there's a paternalistic attitude, and there's a kind of lack of humility. We saw that considerably here. So Paul Offit is a very good scholar of medicine at Penn, children's medicine. He was on the vaccine advisory committees. And one of the things he says, and we say it at the end, the best approach for public health is to tell the truth with nuance. You know, if there's counter evidence, if there's ranges of uncertainty, tell people. You know, people have multiple sources of information. We have a diverse media environment now, and you're trying to pull the wool over people's eyes or just not be frank with them about the limits of your knowledge is proven to be a very bad strategy. So with boosters and so on, the United States was recommending boosters in 2023, 24, I think, for everyone over the age of 6 months. Why were they doing that? Offit said to his colleagues in the vaccine advisory committee, we don't have evidence, you know, for the effectiveness of these boosters for young people. And their response was, we think that old people are more likely to get the vaccine if we recommend them to everybody. That's not a scientific judgment. And that's something that, and in Europe, they were recommending the boosters to people over 65, you know, who are at risk. So the fact is, we've been way out of whack, you know, with this, and a lot of times scientific propounding what we should do, not really based on the science, but based on what they think will be good for us. You know, nudging us to do what they think is the right thing, in case right, but without acknowledging the limits of their knowledge. So I think there needs to be, we stick to liberalism, the pursuit of truth, good evidence. There's better and worse evidence. There's better and worse arguments, and we should put our faith in conscientious pursuit of the better argument. And I have no reason to question that. Specifying a range of uncertainty is not, you know, saying science is bullshit. It's just saying science is honest. So what we want is honesty, not cynicism, because then you might as well say whatever you want if everything's equally true. But I don't think that's the case at all. So anyway, I think the traditional liberal values of liberal education, the pursuit of truth through careful reason giving, reason demanding, and evidence, careful gathering of evidence, and openness to criticism is where we should put our confidence.
Well, thank you for this saddening but thought-provoking talk.
Well, anytime.